What you are about to hear isn't a news update, it's a pattern. And once you see the pattern clearly, you'll never look at the Middle East the same way again. Russia quietly transferring Iskander ballistic missile systems to Iran is not simply a weapons deal, it is a message. And that message is written in the language that only great powers understand, the language of strategic irreversibility. When you hand a country a weapon system that travels at Mach 6 to Mach 7, maneuvers in its terminal phase, carries a 700-kilogram warhead, and lands within 5 to 7 meters of its intended target, you're not giving them a weapon, you're giving them a new kind of leverage. You're giving them the ability to redraw every risk calculation every American planner, every Israeli strategist, and every Gulf Arab monarch has been running for the last 2 decades. And here's what most of the American media is completely missing about this story. It didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened as part of a deliberate, patient, and, frankly, brilliant restructuring of the global power balance that Moscow and Tehran have been building together, quietly, methodically, and with a clarity of purpose that Washington has consistently underestimated. So let's slow down. Let's think about this properly. Because if you really want to understand what Russia sending Iskander systems to Iran means for you, for your country, for the price of oil, for the safety of American service members in the Gulf, and for the long-term architecture of global order, you have to start not with the missiles themselves, but with the relationship that made this transfer possible in the first place. Russia and Iran have not always been natural allies. History is full of moments when they were outright enemies, when Russian czars pushed south and Persian empires pushed north, and entire generations of people died in the space between those ambitions. But something shifted. Something fundamental changed in the relationship between Moscow and Tehran, and it changed precisely because both countries found themselves on the same side of a profound geopolitical argument. The argument over whether American unipolarity, that moment after 1991 when the United States stood as the unchallenged ruler of the international system, was a permanent condition of history or a temporary aberration. Russia under Putin concluded very early that it was temporary. Iran had believed it was temporary ever since 1979. And when two countries share a conclusion that deep, that foundational, it becomes the basis for a partnership that goes far beyond transactional arms deals. It becomes ideological, it becomes structural, it becomes the kind of relationship that survives betrayals, navigates contradictions, and endures because the alternative, isolation and defeat, is too costly for either side. In October 2025, Russia and Iran formalized a comprehensive strategic partnership expanding on their 2021 agreement, creating an institutional framework for technology transfers, joint production, and long-term military cooperation. Now read that sentence carefully because it is the legal and institutional foundation upon which everything else in this story rests. This wasn't two countries shaking hands in a dark room. This was a structured, documented, multilateral framework, and the kind of framework that governments build when they intend for a relationship to outlast any individual leader, any single crisis, any passing moment in diplomatic weather. This is architecture. And what Russia has been doing since that framework was signed is filling that architecture with real content, real weapons, real intelligence, real military hardware that transforms the theoretical partnership into an operational alliance. Russia's military cooperation with Iran intensified during the Ukraine conflict, with Tehran supplying drones and missiles in exchange for advanced systems like S-400 air defenses. Think about the elegance of that exchange for a moment. Iran gave Russia what Russia needed in Ukraine: cheap, mass-producible, effective loitering munitions, the Shahed drones that Russia has been raining on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, power grids, heating systems, and supply lines with devastating effect. In return, Russia gave Iran what Iran needed in the Middle East: advanced air defense systems, and now, if the reports are accurate, Iskander tactical ballistic missiles. This is not charity, this is not sentiment. This is a rational, mutually beneficial strategic transaction between two states that understand their respective needs with great precision, and what it tells you about the future is that this relationship is self-reinforcing. The more Iran provides to Russia, the more Russia provides to Iran. The more capable Iran becomes militarily, the more valuable it is as a partner to Russia. The more valuable it is as a partner, the more advanced the systems Russia is willing to share. The loop closes on itself and gets tighter with every turn. Now let's talk about the Iskander specifically, because the technical details here are not just interesting, they are strategically decisive. The missile's quasi-ballistic flight profile, combined with terminal phase maneuvers at speeds approaching Mach 7, complicates interception by systems such as Patriot PAC-3, Arrow, or Iron Dome. forcing defenders to rely on layered interception and early warning architectures that are neither foolproof nor cost-efficient against saturation or surprise attacks. Let that sink in. The very system that the United States has spent hundreds of billions of dollars developing, selling, and deploying across the Middle East, the Patriot, the Arrow, the Iron Dome, are not reliably effective against a missile moving at these speeds with these maneuverability characteristics. We are not talking about some theoretical vulnerability that exists only in computer simulations. We are talking about a fundamental limitation of existing missile defense architecture when confronted with a weapon of this class. And now Iran potentially has that weapon. Iskander's guidance architecture, integrating inertial navigation, GLONASS satellite updates, and optical scene matching in the terminal phase, allows for a reported circular error probable of as little as 5 to 7 meters, granting it the accuracy required to neutralize hardened command centers, air defense nodes, runways, logistics hubs, and troop concentrations with minimal missile expenditure, 5 to 7 meters. When you hear that number in the context of a weapon with a 700-kilogram warhead, you are hearing about a system that can reliably destroy essentially any fixed military target within its range. Command bunkers, aircraft shelters, ammunition depots, radar installations, fuel storage facilities. Every single element of the infrastructure that makes modern military operations possible is now potentially within reach of a weapon that can hit within the length of a small room. This changes the entire calculus of how you defend a base, how you position your forces, how you decide whether to project military power in a region where this weapon exists, and Iran's range problem, the fact that the basic Iskander only reaches 500 kilometers, may already have a solution. This raises the possibility that Iskander-K systems with R-500 cruise missiles capable of reaching 1,500 kilometers might have been included in the transfer. At 1 to 500 kilometers, you're not talking about hitting targets in neighboring countries. You're talking about hitting Israel. You're talking about hitting US facilities across the broader Middle East region. You're talking about a weapon that transforms Iran from a regional power into something approaching a strategic actor. And here is where the story gets even more complex and far more interesting than the mainstream American media is willing to acknowledge. Because the transfer of Iskander systems to Iran did not happen quietly and without consequence. It happened against the backdrop of a rapidly deteriorating situation that would, within months, explode into something the world had not seen in decades. Since February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel have been engaged in a war with Iran and its regional allies. The conflict began when the United States and Israel launched airstrikes on Iran, targeting military and government sites and assassinating several Iranian officials, including Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Now we have to pause here because this is a detail of profound historical weight. The assassination of a head of state combined with simultaneous strikes on a country's military infrastructure is not a surgical operation. It is an act of war in the fullest possible sense of that term, not just legally, not just diplomatically, but in the raw and visceral sense of what human beings mean when they talk about two nations bringing violence to bear on each other. On 28 February 2026, Israel and the United States began a series of strikes against Iran. They said they aimed to induce regime change and target its nuclear and ballistic missile program. A conditional ceasefire was declared on 8 April, and Iran did not simply absorb this. In response to the attack, Iran launched a series of counterstrikes against Israel, US military bases in the region, and military and civilian locations in Arab states, many of which house US forces. So we now have a situation where US military personnel stationed across the Middle East, in Qatar, in Bahrain, in Kuwait, in Jordan, in Iraq, suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of Iranian missile strikes. American sons and daughters, American service members who woke up one morning to the sound of incoming missile alerts and had to run for cover in countries they were stationed in to protect. This is not abstract geopolitics. This is the operational consequence of the strategic decisions that were made in the years and months leading up to February 2026. And Russia's role in what Iran was able to do with its missiles during those strikes is something that deserves far more attention than it has received. US officials reported that Moscow supplied Iran with real-time data on American warships and aircraft, enabling more precise retaliatory strikes. This assistance included satellite feeds from Russian assets, which helped Iran monitor US movements in the Middle East. This is the point where you have to step back and appreciate the full scope of what Russia has built with Iran. It's not just about transferring weapons, it's about building a complete operational ecosystem, sensors, communications, targeting data, weapon systems. that Iran can draw upon in a conflict with the United States. Russia, in effect, is providing Iran with the eyes, the ears, and the fists that it needs to take on the most powerful military in the history of the world. Not head-to-head, Russia is far too careful and far too strategically disciplined for that, but enough to impose real costs, real risks, real constraints on American military power projection in the region. And what did this cost Russia? Almost nothing in direct terms. Russia did not send a single soldier into combat. Russia did not fire a single missile in anger against a US target. Russia simply sat back, provided intelligence support from satellite assets it was already operating, and watched as the strategic situation in the Middle East reshaped itself in ways that serve Russian interests enormously. On 9th April, Reuters calculations estimated that Russia's mineral extraction tax on oil output would increase from 327 billion rubles in March 2026 to around 700 billion rubles, approximately $9 billion, in April 2026 due to the Iran war. Think about what that means. While a shooting war was happening in the Middle East, while people were dying, while Iranian missiles were striking US bases and Israeli cities and Gulf Arab infrastructure, Russia was sitting there watching its oil revenue nearly double. Because any disruption to Middle Eastern oil supplies, and this conflict created enormous disruptions, immediately benefits Russia as an alternative supplier. Russia wins strategically, Russia wins economically, and Russia wins without firing a shot. That is masterful statecraft, however uncomfortable it is to admit. Now let's talk about what the Strait of Hormuz closure meant for the global economy. Because this is the moment where the abstract world of geopolitics meets the very concrete reality of your gas prices, your grocery bills, and the overall cost of living in the United States. In a March 12, 2026 report, the International Energy Agency said the current conflict was creating the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market, with the flow of oil through the strait decreasing by 20 million barrels per day, and Gulf producers cutting production by at least 10 million barrels a day. Disruptions to natural gas may be even greater. 20 million barrels per day. To put that number in perspective, the entire global oil market produces somewhere around 100 million barrels per day under normal conditions. So we're talking about a 20% reduction in global oil supply, not over the course of a year, not gradually as production declined, but suddenly, within days, as a direct result of the closure of a single maritime choke point. One March 22nd analysis concluded that even if hostilities concluded immediately, it could take 4 months for energy markets to return to normal. 4 months. That is 4 months of elevated energy costs passed directly to American consumers. 4 months of inflation pressure on an economy that was already dealing with significant challenges. 4 months of increased costs for every business, every farmer, every truck driver, every airline, every manufacturer in the United States of America. This is the real cost of these strategic miscalculations. Not just lives, though lives matter enormously, but the economic well-being of ordinary Americans who had absolutely no say in the decisions that led to this outcome. In response to the attacks, Iran said it would shut the Strait of Hormuz, a major oil and trading route. While a small number of ships permitted by Iran have continued to use the strait, almost all shipping has ceased, and here is where the Iskander systems become relevant again in a way that is chilling. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just a geographic choke point, it is a military choke point. To keep it open against Iranian opposition requires projecting naval and air power into a confined body of water where Iran has land-based missiles, coastal defense systems, mines, fast attack boats, and now, potentially, the most accurate short-range ballistic missile in the world. Every American carrier that enters the Persian Gulf does so with knowledge that Iran can now potentially target it with weapons that our existing defense systems cannot reliably stop. That carrier, carrying 5,000 American sailors and representing $13 billion in construction costs, is now within range of Bastion P batteries positioned along the Iranian coastline. The Aegis combat system that protects the carrier has never been tested against mass attacks. Simulations suggest that a salvo of missiles approaching from multiple vectors at Mach 2.5 would saturate the defensive envelope. We are in an era where the assumptions that have governed American military planning since the end of the Cold War, assumptions about decisive force projection, about the invulnerability of carrier battle groups, about the ability to impose costs without absorbing them in return, are being systematically challenged by exactly the kind of weapons transfers we are discussing today, and Russia understands this. Russia has understood it for a long time. After decades of studying American military power, its logistics, its alliances, its economic dependencies, and its political constraints, Moscow has drawn a simple conclusion. The most efficient way to limit US power is not direct confrontation but distributed pressure through partners. Iran is the most important of those partners in the Middle East. A country of around 90 million people with a highly educated population, significant scientific capacity, and a large ballistic missile arsenal already developed independently. Its geography alone makes it strategically pivotal, sitting between the Persian Gulf, the Caspian region, Central Asia, and the wider Middle East. In that sense, Iran is not merely a client state. It is a force multiplier. Every capability Russia shares reduces the need for direct Russian deployment. Every intelligence or targeting exchange extends Russian influence without Russian casualties. The strategic value, from Moscow's perspective, is high leverage at low direct cost. Influence projected outward through another actor's geography, resources, and conflict space. But we have to be honest about what this also means for Iran, because the picture is not entirely flattering for Tehran either, and understanding the Iranian side is essential to understanding what comes next. There were extensive protests in Iran in early 2026, driven by a weakened economy and deteriorating infrastructure, showing the regime's fragile domestic legitimacy. Decades of sanctions have hollowed out civilian life. Electricity, water, transport, healthcare, all under strain. And when the bombs began falling in February 2026, the burden was not carried by the Revolutionary Guard leadership. It was carried by ordinary Iranian families who had no role in shaping the strategic choices being made in their name. The regime's willingness to absorb those costs reflects a hard calculation. Survival depends on deterrence, not reform. And here the logic becomes self-reinforcing. Iranian leaders believe that giving up military capability leads not to stability, but to vulnerability. They point to Iraq after Saddam Hussein's disarmament and Libya after Gaddafi dismantled his program as cautionary examples. From their perspective, concessions do not end threats, they invite them. So the response is escalation, more missiles, more drones, deeper partnerships with Russia, including systems like Iskander. In that worldview, deterrence is not optional. It is the only barrier between continuity and collapse. Now let's pull back to the American perspective, because there is a serious conversation the United States needs to have with itself about how it arrived at this point. Beginning in late January 2026, the United States carried out its largest military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. We have seen this before. We know how this story goes. And yet once again, American carriers moved into the Gulf. F-22s deployed to Israel, and the machinery of American military power swung into motion in pursuit of objectives that remain fundamentally unclear. What does the United States actually want from Iran? Regime change, the destruction of the nuclear program, the dismantling of its missile arsenal, the end of Iranian regional influence? These are not compatible goals. A government threatened with disarmament and regime collapse is not likely to cooperate. And yet that contradiction sits at the center of American policy. The failed indirect negotiations in February 2026 over Iran's nuclear program deserve far more scrutiny than they received. Omani mediators reported significant progress and Iranian willingness to make concessions, yet the talks collapsed and military action followed instead. There was a moment when diplomacy appeared to be working, and that moment was abandoned. The consequences of that decision are now being felt not only across the Middle East, but by ordinary Americans at the gas pump, by service members stationed in the region, and by a global economy struggling with the fallout of another expanding conflict. The conflict left enormous damage, thousands dead in Iran and Lebanon, dozens dead in Israel and the Gulf Arab states, and millions displaced across the region, including more than 1/6 of Lebanon's population after renewed Israel-Hezbollah fighting. 1/6 of a country of roughly 6 million people means around 1 million individuals uprooted from their homes, their communities, their sense of stability. That is the human arithmetic of escalation, not abstract figures, but mass displacement on a national scale. This is what happens when great powers and regional actors treat smaller states as arenas for strategy. The civilian cost is never evenly distributed, and it is rarely borne by those making the decisions. At the same time, the conflict is accelerating a broader restructuring of the global order. The Russia-Iran military relationship, including weapons cooperation, intelligence sharing, and targeting coordination, reflects a wider realignment that is reshaping international politics. Diplomatically, Russia and China have coordinated in international forums, including the UN Security Council, to challenge American actions and frame them as violations of sovereignty. This is not only about Iran, it is about a larger shift away from the post-Cold War system in which the United States could act with relatively limited external constraint. Russia, China, Iran, and increasingly parts of the global South are converging around a different idea, a world where American power is no longer dominant, but bounded, contested, and met with coordinated resistance. The moral dimension of this story also deserves serious attention, something American audiences often find uncomfortable. Not because Americans are bad people, but because mainstream discourse rarely allows space for honest moral reflection on US foreign policy. The Iran-Israel conflict did not emerge in a vacuum. Iran's ballistic missile program, including systems like the Emad, was shaped by the memory of the Iran-Iraq War, when Iraqi Scud missiles struck Iranian cities while the United States provided Saddam Hussein with intelligence, equipment, and diplomatic cover. Iran lost hundreds of thousands, possibly up to 1 million people. From Tehran's perspective, its missile program became a lesson in deterrence. What happens when a state cannot strike back? Understanding this history does not mean endorsing Iran's actions. It means acknowledging the context in which they were formed. Whether that deterrence is moral is one question, whether it is real and consequential is another. It is both. Similarly, the American public was told the F-35 partnership with Israel was about defending democracy and preserving stability. In practice, it has also fed a cycle of escalation in which each new weapon system raises stakes and increases the scale of eventual conflict. The destroyed F-35s, whatever the final verified number, represent more than hardware or tax dollars. They represent a strategic bet made on behalf of citizens who were never fully part of the decision-making process, and the consequences of those decisions do not remain abstract. They return in the form of burning hangars, volatile markets, higher energy prices, and economic instability that affects ordinary people who had no role in choosing the policies that produced them. What you are about to hear isn't a news update, it's a pattern. And once you see the pattern clearly, you'll never look at the Middle East the same way again. Russia quietly transferring Iskander ballistic missile systems to Iran is not simply a weapons deal, it is a message. And that message is written in the language that only great powers understand, the language of strategic irreversibility. When you hand a country a weapon system that travels at Mach 6 to Mach 7, maneuvers in its terminal phase, carries a 700-kilogram warhead, and lands within 5 to 7 meters of its intended target, you're not giving them a weapon, you're giving them a new kind of leverage. You're giving them the ability to redraw every risk calculation every American planner, every Israeli strategist, and every Gulf Arab monarch has been running for the last 2 decades. And here's what most of the American media is completely missing about this story. It didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened as part of a deliberate, patient, and, frankly, brilliant restructuring of the global power balance that Moscow and Tehran have been building together, quietly, methodically, and with a clarity of purpose that Washington has consistently underestimated. So let's slow down. Let's think about this properly. Because if you really want to understand what Russia sending Iskander systems to Iran means for you, for your country, for the price of oil, for the safety of American service members in the Gulf, and for the long-term architecture of global order, you have to start not with the missiles themselves, but with the relationship that made this transfer possible in the first place. Russia and Iran have not always been natural allies. History is full of moments when they were outright enemies, when Russian czars pushed south and Persian empires pushed north, and entire generations of people died in the space between those ambitions. But something shifted. Something fundamental changed in the relationship between Moscow and Tehran, and it changed precisely because both countries found themselves on the same side of a profound geopolitical argument. The argument over whether American unipolarity, that moment after 1991 when the United States stood as the unchallenged ruler of the international system, was a permanent condition of history or a temporary aberration. Russia under Putin concluded very early that it was temporary. Iran had believed it was temporary ever since 1979. And when two countries share a conclusion that deep, that foundational, it becomes the basis for a partnership that goes far beyond transactional arms deals. It becomes ideological, it becomes structural, it becomes the kind of relationship that survives betrayals, navigates contradictions, and endures because the alternative, isolation and defeat, is too costly for either side. In October 2025, Russia and Iran formalized a comprehensive strategic partnership expanding on their 2021 agreement, creating an institutional framework for technology transfers, joint production, and long-term military cooperation. Now read that sentence carefully because it is the legal and institutional foundation upon which everything else in this story rests. This wasn't two countries shaking hands in a dark room. This was a structured, documented, multilateral framework, and the kind of framework that governments build when they intend for a relationship to outlast any individual leader, any single crisis, any passing moment in diplomatic weather. This is architecture. And what Russia has been doing since that framework was signed is filling that architecture with real content, real weapons, real intelligence, real military hardware that transforms the theoretical partnership into an operational alliance. Russia's military cooperation with Iran intensified during the Ukraine conflict, with Tehran supplying drones and missiles in exchange for advanced systems like S-400 air defenses.